Hello, everyone, and welcome to this PI webinar. My name's Nick Cuthbert. I'm the Director of Insight at the PI. And for the next hour, we're going to be talking about agency regulation and where do we go from here. This is a live webinar, so people are joining us now. I can see the attendant count going up. Please use the chat function on the side of the screen to tell us where you're from, engage with the conversation. You can use later in the session, you can use the question mark tab to ask a formal question to our panel. And later on, we'll get to answering those. I'm joined today by a fantastic panel. We've got Craig Riggs, who is the editor for ICEF Monitor. Hi, Craig. Craig is literally in his car. You have pulled over, haven't you, Craig?
I'm reporting from the field today, Nick. Yes, I have pulled over. I'm hands-free.
In the Caribbean, we might say.
Yes, well, deep in the field, yes.
Deep in the field.
We leave no stone unturned in our coverage.
Craig, fantastic to have you on. We have Jackie Jenkins, who is Global Relationship Manager for Education at the British Council. Hello, Jackie.
Yeah, hi, Nick. Although I should have edited that job title. That was my old job title. I actually became the Global Lead for International Student Mobility when the British Council reformed into different programs. And so I've been the Global Lead for International Student Mobility since 2022. So my bad. Hi, guys.
Everybody knows who you are, Jackie. That's what matters. We've got Eddie West, the Assistant Dean for International Strategy and Programs at San Diego State University, getting up very early in the morning for us. Eddie, did I get the right job title?
You got it, Nick. You nailed it. Well done.
Good morning, Eddie. Yeah.
Hello.
And we have Nick Golding, who is now Vice President for Government Relations and Strategic Partnerships at ICEF. Nick, this is a new title. You're no longer at the PI. You've moved to ICEF. Have I got your job title right?
You have, but it's relatively new. I still got the old logo from the studio.
He's finding it very strange not being the host of these sessions. Okay, we're going to talk about agent management. Just before we came on this call, we went live. We were discussing, because it was just a few months ago, really, Jackie, we talked about the AQF and the British Council developments in terms of that training program. Eddie, you had a book published on agent management, and we were talking to you about that last year. And Nick's timely move to ICEF. We can't believe quite how much has changed in such short a space of time in terms of the rhetoric and conversation around agents. And that is really proven by the huge turnout on this call, lots and lots of people registering. At the moment, all of the major study destinations, probably bar the US, has been talking at the highest levels of government and on the front pages of our newspapers about the role and integrity of agents supporting international student recruitment. This is all linked to immigration and this demand suddenly to prove that agents are regulated. The terms that have been coming out are things like unscrupulous agents, bad actors, these kind of things being talked about all the time in parliaments and so on. So Craig, I'm going to come to you first here to set the scene for us. ICEF Monitor, you've been covering all of these stories. This is really the UK, Canada and Australia going through this. Can you kind of summarize this shift of tone around agents?
I'll have a go at it. I'll try to keep it fairly brief. But I think it's fair to say that the national governments in the three destinations that you're thinking of, Australia, Canada, the UK, are all in a fairly interventionist mood as far as the international education sector is concerned. We're seeing major public policy moves in each country that are having a significant impact on the sector. In Australia, that's taken the form of wide-ranging reforms to immigration policy. Those new settings are fairly targeted as far as international students are concerned, but they've led to a much different approach to student visa processing in Australia, and we're now seeing record high visa rejection rates as a result. In Canada, the main event has been the introduction of a cap on international enrollment for 2024 and 2025. That's pretty relatively recently announced, and it's being implemented very quickly. It's led to the effective suspension of student visa processing for many new applicants, and it's introduced a great deal of confusion in the marketplace, I think it's fair to say. And there are important changes afoot in the UK as well. As of January, most international students are no longer permitted to bring accompanying dependents, and that decision already appears to be having an effect on HE enrollments this year. And just this week, on Monday, the Home Office officially commissioned a review of the UK's post-study work rights policy, the graduate route. Be a closely watched event now for these next weeks. I think that policy environment is the context for a much wider discussion around quality concerns and industry standards in each country. Those discussions have impacted a number of different aspects of the international education sector, including in education agents. There's been a great deal of discussion in recent months around the role of agents and what measures, if any, are in place to ensure good professional conduct on the part of agents and on the part of institutions that are engaged with agents. But here's the thing: there's very little very little in the way of government regulation of agents in any of those destinations at the moment. Canada and the UK rely very much on self-regulation measures within the industry. Of course, in the UK, there's the agent quality framework. I'm sure we'll be talking about that a lot today, but it's essentially a package of measures that emphasizes agent training and codes of practice for both agents and educators. Canada focuses on agent training as well, but there's little or no regulation of agents in the country otherwise. Australia is a much more heavily regulated destination when it comes to agents. There's governing legislation in place, but that legislation is largely aimed at the Australian institutions and the requirements it places on them for how they work with agents, right? So it's a little bit different in that sense. So I think the question in front of us from all of that is, as an industry at the moment, is what can we do to build on and strengthen the quality assurance measures that are already in place and to advance professional standards in the sector? I think that it feels to me like that's really the conversation we're having these days.
Yeah, the perfect summary. And it's really interesting because we've clearly got a very global audience here, people tuning in from all around the world, which we can kind of see in the chat. Jackie, give us the perspective in the UK at the moment. We've had a series of very high profile newspaper exposés in some ways about the education industry. The Sunday Times article, but there was a Financial Times article, a big issue article on this as well. Can you summarize the kind of conversations you're having at the moment and people kind of referring or being aware of this kind of wider coverage?
Yeah, I think I can. I think it's really important to note, though, before we go into the current context, the kind of values and the understanding of the international student mobility ecosystem at large, and every country within that space has got a duty of care, and all stakeholders have got duty of care to kind of take the industry and its mission and purpose within that space. It's not just about trade, it's not just about education, it's not just about soft power. International student mobility has got so many benefits, and within that space, agents play a pivotal role. Now, it's really interesting, 20 years at the British Council, but it was indeed the government many moons ago that mandated the British Council to close down its counselling services and to start training agents. That was indeed a growth strategy. And sometimes agents have been seen as a part of a growth strategy. Between 2011 and 2022, the UK government had and the UK sector, and there was no system in place. So there was a bit of a vacuum between 2011 and 2022 where there wasn't an agent quality framework. There was no kind of national investment in this space to really understand the international education ecosystem and what that meant for student mobility in the UK. Now, in many ways, we can go back to why was the agent quality framework designed in the first place? And that was a review that Boiler and Keyser did to understand national systems what were the Australians doing? What were the Canadians doing? What were the other English-speaking study destinations doing beyond the London Statement in order to ensure that these ecosystems were working most effectively? And that's really to protect the reputation of that receiving study destination and provide the confidence for the student and those that influence the students moving forward. Our perspective at the British Councils, we took on that research, right? We were like, okay, Boiler and Ukiza have exposed something here, and there's some recommendations here for us to take forward. So back in 2022, we launched, using FCDO funding, an agent training mechanism, and that was in part just to say, listen, there is really good actors out there with the right knowledge, right expertise, and we can make more, build a public awareness around that. And we saw the growth in numbers of agents doing our training. Just, it's gone from strength to strength until last December, the sector then pledged to the AQF. So the AQF is no longer what I call a carrot. Being associated to good practice. It became more of a stick. It became, actually, the sector are now going to mandate all of their agents to do the British Council training, and actually to say we are going to hold these relative kind of tools and quality assurance checks to demonstrate that we are looking for the greater good of the sector. At that point, our training has grown exponentially. Okay, we've gone from 7,000 or 8,000 registered to over 20,000 registered. Certified training is going through the roof, and every time I look at the figures, I'm like, wow, okay, this is becoming big. Since the Sunday Times article, however, it's moved a step further, and it's meant that pathway providers wanting to get involved, organisations such as ISEF are now saying that we can do something in this space to provide more confidence to the sector around, the quality assurance of agents. I think it's really important, though, to state that there's quite a lot of myths around the role that agents can play. Agents can't get a student into a university without the university wanting that student. So can we kind of sit back and say, we all need to take accountability in this? The institution is still recruiting that student. The agent has got its due diligence to make, and the student needs to be empowered about which agents they work with. I think the AQF has done that. I think the AQF has actually provided a space and empowered each stakeholder to understand what good looks like. Yeah. I'm aware, however, that there's more to be done potentially in helping that system kind of move to the next stage.
Okay, that's a really interesting kind of history of where it's come from, and as you say, it's quite interesting because of some of these media articles and some stakeholders from outside of the industry taking more of an interest. It's actually triggering more of the stakeholders to take the training more seriously and make sure that they're proving, the quality assurance that's being asked of them. Eddie, I'm going to come to you. The US isn't kind of going through the same things in terms of these changes to the sector in terms of immigration and capped by whatever means in terms of student numbers. But it's a very fragmented and complex sector in the US. In some ways, it's the most deregulated or unregulated. Tell us about the perspective from the US and also the role of AIRSI in that as an accrediting body.
Yeah, I think you're right, Nick, to say that it's very unregulated, like the other countries, excepting maybe Australia and New Zealand. In the US, no federal government regulation, no real state government regulation as well. US is, it's unique in many respects, right? Compared to the major destination countries we've already been talking about. We, in some respects, are the least dependent currently on agent-based recruitment, and yet that's absolutely changing, meaning more and more institutions are working with agents. You see that borne out in survey data again and again. I don't think that's going to change. So you're going to see more uptake in the future as well. which then begs the question of, do we have a regulatory environment here that's fit for purpose with growing numbers of schools working with agents? There's also a long history we can go into, at least briefly, where there was a lot of aversion to agent-based recruitment in the States in the past. NACAC, a place where I used to work, was largely opposed to the practice. Education USA, which I think is the closest equivalent to the British Council here in the States, had a policy prohibiting Education USA advising centers from engaging with agents. That's since changed. NACAC since changed its stance as well. So these are some contributing factors to the growing use of agencies. AIRC is also a very influential player in the space here in the States. For those who aren't familiar with the organization on the call, it's a nonprofit organization, so it's essentially an aspect of industry self-regulation that was formulated about 15 years ago. And to their credit, I think they've done a lot of good work in terms of adding some guardrails. The way, in a nutshell, that AIRC works in terms of their quality assurance role, they operate a certification process, and an agency who wants to undertake that process can go through it. It's very, very closely modeled on the way U.S. higher education accreditation works, where the agency will then undergo a self-study. They will submit information to AIRC. AIRC then sends an external reviewer to examine the agency, corroborate what the agency's reported, also, unearth some other insights. And then a certification board, a voluntary certification board, will look at the totality of all of that information that's been supplied and unearthed and make a decision as to whether to certify that agency or not. That's gone a long way toward giving institutions more assurance that there's a quality mechanism in place. One of the challenges, however, is unlike the British Council, as I understand it, trains the agents themselves, right? The advisors. AIRC, by contrast, is focused on the organization itself, the company, certifying the company. Because that's the case, I mean, they've done great work, but I think to this day, they've certified something to the tune of 100 agencies, which we know is a real drop in the bucket in terms of the broader environment. And so I think when we're talking about agency regulation and designing something that's more fit for purpose in a more global sense, you have to look at what's something that can scale meaningfully. So again, AIRC's been a boon to U.S. schools that want to work with agents, but I think in a broader sense, there's a lot more work to be done.
So there's some real crucial elements to this. So we're talking about how do we accredit a business, and often a global business in terms of agencies, but also how do we certify the individuals and the advice they're giving and the balance between that. And then we have kind of two approaches here. We have British Council with open source, free training for anybody who wants to be involved in supporting students to come to the UK. So improving that quality of knowledge and service. And Jackie, would, I guess, there is a cost implication to that, who pays for that and so on. And then you have a non-profit association like AIRC, I guess with quite an expensive cost attached to that, Eddie, in terms of participating in that. But, quite high level accreditation and auditing of agencies, but like you say, not getting to the scale, anywhere near the scale that we require.
I think it's important, Nick, on the AIRC model to know that AIRC are providing something that in the UK the providers do, the universities do. So, okay, in the UK you could turn around and say which country's got an endorsed register of agents, and AIRC might have its endorsed register of agents or agencies, maybe you should say 100 agencies. Who does the monitoring and compliance of those? In the USA, you might have AIRC doing it. In the UK, you've got the provider doing it. And the provider works with way more than 100. And, you might think about who's responsible for the due diligence. In the UK, it's the provider that does it. And the provider's got, therefore, its way of doing it for its own ambitions. And they're not kind of pushed into working with, let's just say, 100 agents. You can see through our database the sheer size and scale of this. And yes, it might be a case of 80% of students might come through, 30% of the providers and vice versa. But there's so many. The ecosystem is so complex and it changes from destination to destination. And the UK is receiving students from over 200 destinations. Yeah. All of those have got vastly different ecosystems. There's not any one multinational that's got offices in all of those countries, and so on and so on and so on. So we have designed something that is able to be adopted globally. And that's really, really an important space. Doesn't mean to say that ASC are doing something that the UK is not doing. The UK is doing it, but it's the provider doing that work. And the provider doing that quality assurance, as opposed to the ASC and being a third party doing it on behalf of.
Yeah, and it's probably worth saying at this point that the British Council training is available through the ICEF Academy as well. It's available to access that way. It is open source. It's supposed to reach as many people as possible. Okay. A quick reminder to our audience: if you have a formal question, I'm sure we have agents amongst the audience as well as institutions. People might be looking or have suggestions around how agents can be regulated, what they want to see from a national level or from an institutional level. So please put your questions in the question mark tab and we will definitely get to them. I'm really fascinated in what people are thinking about this discussion. Nick, I'm going to come to you. What we're talking about here is you're seeing, and Jackie's example is a national level training program. But what she's then said is that actually the institutions perform a different role. So they have their own training and their own vetting of agents. So already it's quite fragmented. But also this is just UK specific. This isn't a global view. Whereas most of the agents that we work with now are supporting all of the major English-speaking destinations. So tell me what your view is here about these different types of agent management and kind of what's the missing link here? How can we make this much more efficient?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I applaud all of the initiatives that are being taken. I'm old enough and ugly enough to know that this issue has been around for nearly as long as international mobility at scale. I began working with agents in 1992, and people said, "Ooh, is that a good idea?" And and so on. So arguably, it is high time that there has been a catalyst or a series of catalysts to address this issue once and for all, and park it so that the Sunday Times doesn't fasten on it and make the industry's life a misery and introduce a huge amount of uncertainty. But I do think that while national initiatives are very welcome, there are potential issues about the consequences of some of those initiatives. Now, I know Jackie is going to disagree with me about this, but I think one risk is that bad actors simply turn their attention to a different market. So they're censured or prescribed by the UK, and it's perfectly available to them to say, well, I'll work with Australia then. The other possible consequence, which I know Jackie does believe in, is that bad actors are driven underground, and that actually doesn't help us unless we are able to censure them in some way and prevent them from operating. Whether or not you agree with what I've just said, national initiatives cannot provide effective global sanctions against malpractice, whereas we believe at ICEF that we can. And that's not just barring agents from our events. IAS will give a real-time update on an agency's status, which is visible to providers and end users alike. And that's both a significant benefit and a true deterrent to rogue agents. If you've got students and their parents turning up at sunrise and checking their QR code to check the status of that agent, that's got teeth, right? There are issues about how we get the message out there to parents and students about doing that. But I think if we've got the apparatus in place, that's a great benefit. And I think that's another important point, which I haven't seen anything yet, Jackie, tell me if I'm wrong here, that provides global visibility to the status of the agent, whether that's for, and specifically for the end user. We've got a lot of things taking place that are protecting the integrity and the reputations of universities and national systems. But I don't think we've got anything in place yet that operates in the student's home country and shows the status of that agent in real time. And I think, you also mentioned the distinction between ASE and the UK in terms of due diligence being done by, one is done centrally, the other is distributed due diligence. I think there is a risk actually that these national initiatives aren't joined up, and that's where I think ICEF can have a place to play and introduce some consistency into the accreditation system, even if that's only for a core element of the bigger due diligence that universities will undoubtedly have to do for themselves.
Yeah.
So there's that, and look, we've got real reach. We have 25,000 identified agents that know us, we can communicate with, we can advise them that they need to be doing this in the interests of themselves and the industry as a whole. And finally, we've got apparatus in place. We've been doing this since 2010. So that takes a lot of grief and heavy lifting away from people.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the ICEF brand is really the trusted place in terms of introducing institutions and agencies together in that trusted environment. Eddie, you're listening to Nick here. Firstly, what do you think about this idea that there needs to be some regulation that is global, supranational, that we need, because of the way of the industry now, that we need some sort of top-down view of the whole sector? A national level perspective is not enough.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, for those of us that have been in this space for a while, like Nick G mentioned, we've seen these issues come up time and again. From my vantage point in the US, we saw the big dust up with the Times article in the UK, and there's a feeling that it is almost inevitable that we're going to see the same thing here in the US if we don't get our act together and frankly be more ambitious in terms of what that regulatory apparatus looks like, and indeed have it be multinational, not just merely advancing the interests of one country. I think for the sake of the conversation, I want to come back to something also that was mentioned earlier, Nick C, about the AIRC model. I think we have to also look not just at a sort of one point in time quality assurance snapshot, but ongoing enforcement. And I think Nick G mentioned, a setup that would involve teeth and something that would encourage not just a one-time I'm doing my best behavior kind of snapshot, but have agents on notice that they can't misbehave. And to be fair to my esteemed colleagues at AIRC, I've got a lot of dear friends and colleagues at the organization. I have a lot of respect for the organization, but their model, because agencies have to pay so much, and by the way, it's $10,000 for 1 year's worth of certification. It's, I believe, either $2,000 or $4,000 for annual payment thereafter, depending on the size of the agency. Number one, that high price tag disincentivizes or is perceived prohibitive by many agencies, and that's why the pool is so small. But number two, if you're getting real, that's a powerful incentive for AIRC to not act on instances of misconduct that arise, which they periodically do among their AIRC certified members. And there have been a number of examples of this out of China, out of South India, where there's been misconduct reported by mainstream media, trade media. AIRC says we're going to look into it, and they either exonerate their agent or they turn a blind eye, sweep the matter under the rug. That's a real problem in terms of ongoing enforcement of standards. And so I think, it's a two-level thing. You got to think about how to do that one snapshot in time, and how do you actively enforce things moving forward. And indeed, yes, I think in an international, multinational context is ultimately the direction of travel. I mean, we've got to go in that direction. That it only makes sense.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Even in the promotion of this webinar, there was a comment about who guards the guards, who's best placed to be the enforcers of these kind of things. And there is this big question mark over the private sector and what role they have in accrediting the people they work with. So we've seen some big agents, some aggregators. We saw a block list come out from one of them in terms of a block list, a public block list of agents, and other initiatives around quality control being made more transparent. But, I think there was an Earl Blaney quote that talked about, you don't put the fox in charge of the hen house, is how he put it. There is other interests here around, as you've already described, around commercial interests around which agents have worked with who. So, Nick, I think I'm going to come back to you on this one because obviously there is a commercial element to ISEF and ISEF's activity. How do you feel about this in terms of, so I guess some people would want to see government or, national associations be the regulator of this. How would you defend ISEF's position in terms of being a private sector player?
Well, first off, we don't see ourselves as being separate from any government initiative or government body. We feel that what we're doing is complementary. It's an integral part of that, and we're not in any way in opposition or competition with it. I think look, I've been in the private sector for a long time, as everybody on the call knows. I think we should be wary of ideological resistance for the sake of it. And here's my analogy. I suspect that nearly every institution on this call undergoes an annual audit of their financial probity that is conducted by an accountancy firm that is in the private sector. There is therefore nothing intrinsically wrong with entrusting that kind of activity to the private sector. And we're not in any way partial to a particular country, whether that's source or destination. We've got actually very little vested interest in the recruitment of individual granular numbers like that. So I think we can occupy an objective, non-partisan place. And okay, so we're private sector, but the private sector also we are scrutinized. We also have reputationally a really important position to protect within the sector as a whole. We have to get this right.
And what you're talking about as well is, I think, which is so true and so many people identify with, is that institutional staff are so stretched and under-resourced in terms of the necessary time and expertise to really audit and regulate their networks sufficiently. They need help with that. Craig, would you agree with that? I mean, you're covering so much of the sector on the monitor, ISEF monitor. You're seeing, all of these big existential debates about parts of the industry, the delivery, new markets, enrollment swings. I think agent management and the auditing of agents is often neglected because there's just no time.
Well, there's no time, but there's, the type of due diligence that we're talking about here, you know, if it's being done on the provider side, if you're evaluating an agency that you have not had prior contact with and that has no other sort of accreditation associated, the vetting process can be significant, right? The AIRC, we should understand that in this conversation there are perhaps three components that are kind of swirling together. One is agent training. We've talked a lot about agent training on the call today, and it's a very important feature of sort of advancing industry standards, certainly. You know, there are many different players that are involved in agent training, and certainly some important training options that have emerged in the industry. There's also the question of agent codes of conduct or good practice guidelines, and there are many of those out there as well. And you know, you can attach questions to that as to how those are enforced or how they're monitored and so on. But they're a distinct aspect of kind of a quality assurance scheme for agents. And then there's the question that we've landed on here, which is agency accreditation. They're not. I mean, I'm someone who looks around the world for these things all the time, and there aren't many agency accreditation schemes that are operating in the industry today. There's AIRC, which is a very important model, I think, for us all to consider. There's ICEF agency status, which is ICEF's own agency accreditation model. And when we look at, you know, what an effective model looks like in that respect, I think it has a few components, like as Nick G said earlier, you know, that you need a model that reaches across national boundaries and that can be, you know, an effective option around the world, both in terms of providing access to that model, but in terms of providing, you know, a mechanism for compliance and monitoring of agent performance. As Eddie suggested, I think you need a model that can scale. You know, the AIRC model, I think, is a really important example. But I think it is, you know, I've always thought of it in the way that Eddie described earlier, that it's a model that comes from it's based in the notion of how accreditation works for higher education institutions in the US. It's a process that takes several months. You know, it's projected to take 9 months. I think it can take more than that, certainly in some cases. And as Eddie says, it takes, you know, a lot of money for an agency to go through that process, which effectively precludes most agencies in the world from participating. Right? So you need a model that can scale. You need a model that can pass national boundaries, and you need a model that relieves individual institutions of some of that heavy lifting of vetting. You know, I don't think there's any accreditation scheme that will ever be available in the industry that would eliminate the need for an institution to do some of that vetting and due diligence themselves. But I think what you want is a model that allows you as an institution to say, okay, there's an agent that's recognized, they're in compliance with a certain code of practice, they've demonstrated their bona fides in all of these different respects. The model is transparent and the institution can see that. So if I'm an institution, before my work on ICEF Monitor, I was recruiting for institutions here in Canada, and I can say firsthand that that's a tremendous burden for any institution to have to evaluate a new agency contact from scratch. And so I think that is part of what we're looking for here is an accreditation scheme that allows for a kind of baseline of vetting that an individual institution can then build off in an effective way, that relieves the institution of some of that burden and allows them to even go deeper in some respects that are meaningful to them, right? Those are the characteristics of as Nick says, if we're going to get this right, and I think as an industry, we have a clear interest in doing so. Whether it's the Sunday Times or whether it's the looming possibility that Eddie refers to of greater government interest in this area, like we're seeing this play out in all these policy movements that I was talking about earlier now. And it's you can either wait for government to do this for you, or as an industry, we can take the matter in hand and really, you know, work our way towards an effective model that combines those components, right? Agent training, agent accreditation, and agents codes of practice. That's what I think we're looking for. And I think as an industry, we have to recognize that we have to take this question in hand and deal with it ourselves, or somebody's going to deal with it for us.
Yeah, well said. I think the direction of travel here is a global standard of accreditation that means trust, and that we have stakeholders clearly looking for that list of approved agents, looking for people that have been accredited and vetted. Jackie, when the Sunday Times article came out, the AQF has been so widely adopted in the UK, lots and lots of universities signing up to the pledge, and that pledge means that they're really taking on the best practice guide, even into their legal contracts and the way they're working with agents. But that Sunday Times article triggered a statement from Universities UK to say that they were going to review the AQF again, I guess, to make sure it's more robust, and maybe to look at whether there is a mark of accreditation within there, as opposed to this certification of counsellors that's happening at the moment.
I don't think there's any implication from Universities UK that they're looking to accredit. I think they're basically wanting to give the AQF more teeth. So what do you do when things go wrong? How does the UK, I mean, since the Sunday Times article, then I know that the sector representatives from Boiler and Universities UK, or UKI in particular, have actually audited a number of institutions and asked them, how many agents do you work with? And on average, it's 150. How many agency contracts have you let go? And it's like 0.56, less than one in most agencies have, most universities have more than 150 contracts with agencies. The second part is, and I think we do need to come back to it, the idea of small agencies, sub-agencies, non-contracted agencies. The ecosystem is vast. And, you know, many agents, individuals, will sub on behalf of another agency if they're there to serve that student. We've got to be in a space whereby we look at the entire ecosystem. I don't think in any of the conversations that I've been exposed to is the sector bodies looking for an accreditation scheme as such. However, I think there would be, and I do agree with Nick G. You know, this is a baseline. This is a UK framework, and this is how the Canadians, that's their baseline, and this is the Australian baseline. There are commercial providers and other providers that can say, right, we understand all the national frameworks, and we can help providers in this space better navigate this through us. And so I can see that organisations such as ISF and AIRSI, you know, and others can go, you know, that step further to make it easier for providers, to make it easier for agents, to make it easier for students to navigate this, right? I'm here to talk about this as a UK as a study destination and empower the students that might be choosing the UK, i.e. UK bound students, to be more reassured about what agents they work with. But I'm just as interested in making sure that international student who wants to go to Australia has got the right advice. You know, at the end of the day, we want to protect the international student, and we want to protect all receiving study destinations. You know, and if there is a space for a provider such as ISF with the ISF network as it is, I can see a role for you in that space. I really can. You know, it's just a case of we understand this is the national levels of working, and we can help the ecosystem within that space navigate Australia, Canada, UK, and make sure we get it right on your behalf. You know, there is opportunities here. I'm not saying that there isn't. I just don't think we should be aiming this at, should we be accrediting agencies? And that to me is the kind of, is the wrong space. It's a case of supporting the provider do their due diligence, supporting agents do their due diligence, and supporting students do their due diligence through the networks that you have and through the infrastructure that you have. And maybe that might mean you providing them with a badge and it could be an ICEF accreditation, but when it comes to and that builds on the national frameworks, but when it comes to this kind of bigger, bolder, this is going to have government backing, then that's when I kind of get a bit stuck. I'm like, is that a force for good? Or is there a way in which we can build on the AQF and take out the positives in this and help people adopt the AQF framework?
Okay. Yes, Eddie.
Can I'd love to just jump or piggyback on something Jackie said. I think she made a really important point among many. In thinking about our call and our conversation today and in having a previous conversation, it struck me that, not to get too abstract about this, but a lot of the pre-existing agency quality assurance efforts have really been focused on nodes. And by nodes, I mean an agency or an individual agent counselor. And yet, as Jackie mentioned, tremendous activity in terms of agent, sub-agent, master agent, sub-agent, agent aggregator, sub-agent. And we know that activity has boomed in recent years. And I think you could make the case, not to be unduly critical of ourselves, but that a lot of what we've come up with up until this point is no longer, or not as fit for purpose in an environment where you have all of this vast sub-agent activity. And I think, therefore, again, to be a little abstract, we've got to be looking at the networks, not just the nodes. We've got to be looking at these relationships. And I think a key question is, how do you assure quality when there's all of that activity going this way and that? And again, kudos to Jackie, because she said something in a call the other day about even these large agents, these behemoth agents act as sub-agents in certain cases. And yet a lot of what we're doing QA-wise really doesn't account for that, not to mention that there's very limited transparency into those relationships. So it's not an easy nut to crack, but I think any fit for purpose transnational effort has to account for that in some meaningful way.
Okay, and it's my understanding that Wheeler are looking at the sharing of information. So kind of how universities talk to each other, and that they vet agencies as an industry as opposed to in individual institutions. But this idea of efficiency, Nick, is wider than that. I mean, agents have to do all of this training and all of this accreditation. They're having to, with all the institutional partners, they have to have training on their portfolios, they're changing courses, and those things. So that kind of knowledge element. And then we've already talked about there's all sorts of different schemes for different countries and hoops they have to jump to get the accreditation. So it does feel like there is a place to draw these threads together. It's not about replacing any of these things, but it's about the efficiency of bringing them all together.
Yeah, Nick, I think that's right. I mean, the focus of our discussion today has been on providers and them doing their due diligence. But I think if we turn the lens around and consider the, shall I say, poor agent for a moment, there is a real risk of audit overload here. Lots and lots of providers from lots and lots of countries doing their due diligence, and possibly having to refresh that due diligence quite regularly. Yeah. Now, that really could mean a great deal of inspection of agents if providers actually have the apparatus and the resources to do that. Whereas I think we can at least take away an element of that and keep the burdens on both the provider and the agent at sensible levels, while still delivering the quality assurance that is much needed.
Okay, right. I'm just going to go to the questions. I want to make sure we answer these. So somebody's asked, how do you manage a global standard emphasizing best practice across such diverse markets, both from a recruitment and an educational point of view? I mean, we've touched on this about.
Can I start a little bit from the pitch there? I mean, it is at scale, isn't it? We've identified the 40 countries that send more than 1,000 new students to the UK. And we've absolutely focused on those 40 countries. Now, our 40 countries that send to the UK will be different to the 40 countries that might send elsewhere. I mean, they're the main sending markets, but our proportions will be different. We might have had more from sub-Saharan Africa, whereas Australia might get more from East Asia, etc. We've got slightly different major sending markets. I think we've also got to look at the diversity, though, and whatever we do here has to be fit for purpose in all countries, in all sending countries. So yeah, we prioritised the largest sending markets, just so we can absolutely embed a new framework and embed a new system. But that's not to say that the other countries don't matter. It's just a case of let's make sure that we embed the system in the bigger sending countries first. So in addition to things like the online training, which is absolutely critical, and we continue to update that all the time, with things like the Bribery Act or whatever it might be, the things that are actually going to be really key to agent ecosystem in relation to UK law. We also do, we're in a really unique position, I guess. We're lucky in that space that we have offices on the ground in so many places where we can have those networks, agencies in country, and then listen to what their feedback is and how we can shape it for them. I think we need to start working with agents as partners in this, and not we're going to accredit you, we're going to regulate you. That we're all in this together, right? We've got the national agencies, the associations, the receiving institutions, the students themselves, and the agencies, and and the aggregators and everything else. We all need to work together for this industry to work and to do as we all want it to achieve. So I'm going back to saying, you've got to start somewhere, but whatever you design has to work everywhere.
And Nick, this comes back to surely the supranational global perspective. There's so many nuances to different recruitment markets and different market conditions that affect students, which affect applicants. And so you need people with the expertise of seeing all of that and understanding it in context.
You do, but I think coming back to your question, how do you have a standard globally, etc.? Well, I think you have to have, and our process does have, some robustness about it, and that applies to the accreditation of each applying agency. I mean, we do ID verification checks using cutting-edge ID technology that covers 3,000 documents. It works in 200 countries. We examine the agency's digital footprint, and that includes student feedback. It's not just the website and the agency's filtered messaging. We do verification of placement numbers and to where and what the success rates of those students was. We take references with 4 providers from a list of 8, and 2 of those must be state recognized or public institutions. So, for example, a university in the UK. We look at memberships and associations. We do personal screening, and to Jackie's point here, we've got 20 agent relation managers around the world, as well as other representatives. And Jackie made a really important point. I mean, first we can do personally some of that screening, but also we're listening in those source markets to what's being said. And there's a further point, a lot of source markets actually want to be seen as trusted markets. So they are encouraging agents to get some form of badge of recognition. We look at promotional collateral. We ask them to sign up to, admittedly, ICES code of conduct, but Craig can talk very articulately to the similarities and difference between that and the UK one and other codes of conduct. But I think one really important thing that I want to say, Nick, is that we reaccredit every year, we re-audit. And to your point about ensuring ongoing standards, that's where I think our apparatus can really help and support universities and relieve them of some of the ongoing monitoring of agents that may well be coming down the line.
Yeah, this robust ongoing process. Okay, next question, because we need to get through these. Mike has said, how do you make institutions engage with any new recommendations or regulations if they are clearly reluctant to do so? And he means that because they're not always transparent about the nature of working with agents and how they pay agencies. A lot of students are unaware that the universities are paying those agencies for services on their behalf. Craig, this is different for different countries, isn't it? In Australia, they have to list the agencies that they work with, and that's very, very transparent in one respect.
Yeah, well, I mean, transparency is something that people talk a lot about when it comes to codes of practice around agents. And, you know, there's some balance to be struck there, obviously, between being transparent in your dealings and so that students, staff, and other stakeholders can understand those relationships that you have with agents in this case, and how those relationships work. It's that's one aspect of transparency. There's another aspect of transparency that says, well, you should publish like a list of agents that you work with. Well, not everybody's comfortable to do that. You know, for some that falls, you know, into the realm of kind of trade secrets for some institutions,
Yeah.
right? They've spent a long time developing those relationships. They don't necessarily want to you know, make it that much easier for the next institution to come along and do that same work. So it's you know, there's a balance to be struck there. I think in terms of how, you know, to reflect that back to the earlier question about the global standard, it's possible, you know, to have, I think part of establishing a global standard is the types of things that Nick G was just talking about, which is, you know, you have some rigor in the process, you have an ongoing sort of compliance and oversight mechanism. I think none of this rises to the level of treating agents as anything other than partners, actually. Like, I mean, ISAF agency status has already accredited something like 1,600 agencies, and there's another plus or minus 600 in the process of being accredited right now. We're not having to encourage agents very much that this is a good idea. You know, there's a certain amount of vetting fatigue in the sector, both from the agency point of view and from the institution point of view. And so anything that relieves some of that burden and allows agents to demonstrate their bona fides to new or established educator contacts, I think is a good and valuable thing. The other aspect of that global standard is that if you look at all the various good practice schemes and codes of conduct, we've made a study of this at ISAF Monitor, incidentally, like looking around the world at, you know, those codes of conduct, where they exist specifically for agents, what are the components? And there's a remarkable similarity amongst them if you go from one to the next. And they revolve around important themes like transparency, like honesty, like accountability, like, you know, integrity in business operations and services to students, right? Those are, so in that sense, you know, those, if we take those as indicators of what the components of a global standard should be, a lot of those important lessons and themes are already there. And we can understand that a lot of that comes from like the firsthand experience, right? That's where best practice comes from. It comes from trying things and figuring out what works, right? So that that's how I read that, is that those important themes that we take out of that, you know, aggregation of codes of conduct around the world are the components of a successful global standard. And that's why we're starting to see those important themes and ideas being reflected more consistently in quality assurance measures that are coming forward in the industry.
Yeah, institutions signing up to these code of conducts, definitely. Okay, and the next question is talking about the fact that there's a lot of saturation in the agency market, a lot of competition, and a lot of smaller agents are being forced to work with master agents because institutions want to just work with a few trusted providers who then manage that network. So they're talking about a kind of monopoly here. Eddie, I'm going to come to you. You mentioned subagents earlier. You know, these kind of big mega master agents having a monopoly in some areas, does that improve our ability to control quality?
I personally don't think so. And I think there are probably going to be different opinions on this topic, but that gets back to, I think, the Earl Blaney quote of, you know, the fox guarding the hen house. You know, not to say that they're not trying to do their best, these master agents, these, you know, they're gobbling up smaller agencies or contracting with thousands upon thousands of sub agencies, but and not to be unfairly critical, but I mean, you mentioned Nixie earlier, the block list that one of the major agent aggregators, you know, was sort of trumping up. That's silly, right? That's saying, look over here at the folks that we're not working with. What we really need to be focused on are, who are you working with? And that's where I think the lack of transparency is quite troubling. And so what I would like to see, at the risk of being naive, is more effort by organizations and individual HEIs to force, you know, agent aggregators and other master agent type models to be much more transparent and forthcoming about who it is that they are working with. And I think that kind of transparency leads to greater accountability. It's a great challenge, though. What that question points to, it's not easy.
Yeah. Okay. I'll go on, Jackie.
Yeah, I think Eddie hit the nail on the head. I mean, we have to embrace that this is a system, and there's but every stakeholder within the system needs to be transparent. Every single stakeholder within that system. Yeah. The UK provider, you know, being open about which agencies they work with, but being mindful that those agencies are sub-agencies. So the agencies that are having sub-agencies to be publishing which sub-agencies they work for. If we are all transparent, then that in itself helps bring more quality to the system.
Yeah. Okay. We have gone over the hour, but I'm going to just keep going because I want to get through all the questions. It's such an interesting topic. There is a question here. People are saying that there seems to be some fear that accreditation will potentially overburden agencies, but leaving it to national agencies, in Philip's opinion, could actually lead to a situation where there's more confusion over quality. I guess this is something we're seeing even in immigration policy. The more you tinker with things, the more confused everybody gets. There's lots of, you know, if there's lots of different accreditation, lots of different rules, it's very hard to have a singular message about, you know, about what's happening and when. Nick, I guess this is kind of what we've been drawing on, isn't it? Is having a kind of singularity to accreditation that brings everything together.
Yeah, and I think also, I think we've got to be really, really clear. We should have done this earlier about our terms of reference here. Agency accreditation is one thing, which is entirely different from certified counsellor training. Now, they are, of course, complementary, and it's interesting. We've got a question in the chat about financial regulation, and I do kind of see this in those terms, that you can have an accredited, for example, bank or whatever, and you have individual advisors within that who have undergone the appropriate training for pensions advice or stock market advice, and so that's really what we're talking about when we talk about, for example, country-specific training. I think there has to be an issue, doesn't there, of global consistency if you've got so many different people from different institutions undertaking due diligence. And I think, you know, it comes back to then at least having at the core of that a commonly understood and trusted kernel as part of that due diligence. But of course, language schools are going to do it differently from universities, from college chains, etc., etc.
Yep. Okay, and the final question, Craig, at the start of this, you painted a really good picture of the challenges institutions are facing, the caps and the immigration policy in different countries that is making it challenging to recruit students. Somebody is saying here that in that competitive market, really are institutions motivated enough to regulate agents because they want that competitive advantage. They want to keep agents happy. They want that relationship rather than the regulation. What do we think about this? Eddie, you talked a little bit already about transparency and competitive advantage. Well, actually, I think, Craig, it was your comment. Is there an appetite in the current climate from institutions themselves to do this because they want a competitive advantage rather than more regulation?
Well, sorry, are you asking me, Nick? Or?
Yeah, go on, Craig. I think you're going to go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I gave you a quick sketch at the start of the call about some of the political or the public policy changes that we're seeing in those major destinations. I think we have to understand that in large measure, those are all politically charged moves by those national governments. All three destinations have recorded significant gains in international enrollment in the years after COVID, particularly in the wake of rising housing costs and limited access to housing or affordable housing. Governments in each country are under a lot of pressure to manage down immigration numbers. That these decisions are politically motivated are also, I think, indicated by the speed in which they're being brought forward. The graduate review that I referred to earlier in the UK was commissioned on Monday this week, and the report is anticipated for middle May. So that's about 10 weeks from now. And even the committee that's going to do that work is saying, like, that's not enough time for us to do this. In Canada, the international student cap is being brought forward with unprecedented speed, I would say. And as a result, creating a great deal of confusion and uncertainty, unnecessarily so, in the marketplace. So I think if I'm an individual institution, I look at those examples and I think that is the other side of this conversation. If we don't take this question in hand and deal with this ourselves as an industry, then we are going to be on the receiving end of government action that we may or may not appreciate. And it's at that point, the government is not going to be making well-considered moves necessarily. I think we're seeing lots of evidence of that, where, some of these measures are not very well targeted. Some of them are overreaching or overcorrection to try and address a perceived quality issue in the marketplace. But it's in the absence of industry action to address these issues, that's what you leave yourself open to. So as competitive as I may be as an individual recruiter for an institution, I have to acknowledge that risk for myself, for my institution, and for the international program that I'm trying to manage.
We'll watch this space. I've got a feeling we're going to be back in just a few months, aren't we? More to discuss. I want to thank the panel. This has been a fascinating discussion. And as I say, I think there's a lot more to come in the very near future on this. Nick, I'm just going to pass it back to you as a kind of outro here. We have the button at the bottom of the screen for ICEF, and for people can click that if they want to know more about the agency accreditation program. But I think people will be interested in your work and your views on this. So how do they get in touch? What are the next steps?
I've put my email address into the chat here. I'll repeat that. It's ngolding@icef.com. Very, very easy. I also happen to be at the Pi Live next week. I'm back, Nick. So people are very, very welcome to collar me in person. And if they suggest a drink, they're even more welcome.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I hope to see many of our audience at the Pi Live next week. Thank you so much for engaging, and I will see you all again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
See y'all.